Hello again. Here we are to discuss Chapter 5 about nonverbal communication. Now, nonverbal communication is a really common phrase. More accurately, we could describe this as non-linguistic communication, meaning not language-based. Because there's lots and lots of language, it doesn't necessarily have to be verbal, right? So any text, anything we write or type, including its font, its size, how we spaced it and formatted it on the page, is technically nonverbal communication, but it's also involving language. Or for example, and we'll cover this a lot today, American Sign Language is nonverbal. There's not any verbal presence coming along with it, but it's linguistic. So it's an entire language with all of the rules of language and syntax and culture and context, but it just happens to be nonverbal. So mostly today, when we talk about nonverbal communication, we're going to stick with what the book calls, right? Like their term, nonverbal communication, fairly important. But keep in mind that even some languages, are completely nonverbal, but it's not just communication. It can be language with all of the rules present. What the book is really talking about here are things like facial expressions and tone of voice and volume and emphasis, gestures, postures, personal space, other sensory input that doesn't involve our voice, like smells or sounds or objects or props, or emojis that go along when we're texting. All of these things are nonverbal communication. And it is really important, and we are going to cover why. Each of these 6 characteristics that the book also lays out that are possessed by nonverbal communication indicate part of why nonverbal, which has also come up in our discussion boards, is so important. So, one reason that nonverbal communication is just as important as language communication is because it is present in almost every context. You and I are not physically in the same room right now, and we are still nonverbally communicating. I will nonverbally know who has watched this video and uses tips from it in their discussion. And you know that I'm super interested in talking to you, even though we're not in the same room, because my posture and my voice and my gestures are all leaning in excitedly, interested, right? So in almost every context, there are nonverbal cues. Even if you're just texting and it's really short, the length of the text is non-linguistic communication. Did you write an entire paragraph? Did you write one letter, like K? Did you say, yes, I am super interested in that, versus, okay. Or emojis, right? I have not yet thought of a communication style that doesn't involve non-linguistic communication. There's almost something about it. The length, the formatting, the font, posture of someone speaking into a video. There's almost always, with communication, an aspect that is nonverbal or non-linguistic, that's not language. And it often, this is another one of its major characteristics, conveys more than the language does. Not always, right? If you are looking at a book, a novel, as communication, right? And it's basically a big fiction novel with no pictures. I would argue that in that context, maybe the language is conveying more than the font or the formatting. Not necessarily, but it's one instance in which the language could convey more than the nonverbals. Or even in this video, right? I am speaking so much that it is likely that my language is conveying more to you than my posture or my tone of voice. Those things are conveying important information, like that I'm interested and engaged, but the bulk of the information is probably still coming from my language. This is not true in most circumstances. Most of the time, unlike in a video or a novel, the nonverbal is giving almost as much, at least as much, and often more than right? If you bump into somebody that you know out in public, grocery store, sidewalk, and you say, "Hey, how are you?" How you ask it conveys how interested or not you are, and how they answer it is more often conveyed by how. The exact words, the language might say, "I'm fine." But everything else about them, their dress, their posture, their gestures, their tone of voice, what color their face is, are they a little bit seasick, you know, are they dizzy and saying, "Yeah, no, I'm fine," and walking away quickly? Or are they beaming with a brand new baby and a baby carrier saying, "I'm fine," and then you know it's more than fine? Often the words, "I'm fine," "How are you?" don't contain as much meaning as everything around it. There are exceptions, like novels and video interactions, but often look for nonverbal, non-linguistic, non-language-based communication to make up almost as much, at least as much, or many times more than as much information as the language. Something else about nonverbal communication is that we tend to believe it more than the words. In that scenario, not only is the nonverbal bringing to the table as much information, even if they brought the exact same amount of information, which one are we more likely to believe? The words, "I'm fine," or somebody who's green in the face and barfing into the bushes as they say, "I'm fine"? Would you believe the words, or would you believe the nonverbal communication that's happening about they're fairly obviously ill? Even just that I, as a human, say "fairly obviously" is indicative of our species' ability to draw so much information from the nonverbals. We heard the verbal, we know what the verbal means, but we're still going to go with what we're seeing in the nonverbal communication department. And often the reason that we rely on it so heavily is that it is a much more common way to understand how a person is feeling. If someone is giving us technical information verbally, linguistically, through language, but we see them barfing, we believe that to be so reliable because it expresses their actual feelings, their body feelings and their emotion feelings, right? They are having an upset stomach. That feeling, that sensory experience, the emotions that go along with that are much more easily expressed through a body because they are bodily sensations than through words. It is possible, and we do it every day, to talk about and use our language to say how we are feeling, right? We could say, "I feel my nose is itchy," right? We have words for "my nose is itchy," but if you see me going like, "Oh my God, hay fever, ah," did my gestures and my face and my posture and my tone of voice, more so than the words about hay fever, manage to bodily describe what is inherently a bodily sensation? We can do this with emotions as well. "I'm really sad." Important words, words that we should listen to, that we should say, that we should feel capable of understanding and processing more thoroughly, with plenty of synonyms and a thesaurus to figure out what's really going on. Despite doing that work, our body, our nonverbal communication, may actually convey more about our sadness than the words we're able to say. And because this access to emotion tends to be so bodily, we tend to believe it more. We should, again, be using all of our words every time we can to talk about our ideas and how we're feeling. And important to verbalize these things, especially because it can help us be self-aware of what actually is happening. We believe people's nonverbal communications because a body is pretty good at describing physically how the body is feeling. Whereas with words, we have to work a little harder, and we should. It is also a really easy way to meta-communicate. Meta-communication has come up before, where we are communicating about communicating. And our nonverbals do this a lot. That the words coming out of our mouth can be altered by physical nonverbal communication that we intend. It's not an accident. I'm not just, absent-mindedly itching my nose. It tends to be something that we have focused on doing, like winking, right? I'm feeling really great would probably mean I'm not feeling super amazing and I'm just joking about it. Or finger quotes. The words coming out of my mouth are the same, but I have added a gesture on purpose, not accidentally. It's not my posture. This is very intentional. It's meta communication. This is my body communicating something about the message that's coming out of my mouth, right? So these are meta. Or if you pretend to whisper something like, you know what I mean? This gesture, this is not an accidental posture. This is on purpose, and it tells any listener an important meta communication about the verbal linguistic portion of the communication that was coming out of my mouth. And these characteristics also have multiple functions, right? So nonverbal communication is present in most contexts. It often conveys as much or more communication than language. It's often more believable and heavily relied on. We believe it over language. It's a primary means of expressing emotion, does meta communication, and it has more than one function. So even as it's meta communicating, number 6 is that all of this has multiple functions, that they can all blend together. All of these gestures and facial expressions and emotions that we trust and rely on can be used for multiple purposes. One of them is managing conversations. So when we are not just in a conversation with one person, or even if we're in a conversation with one person and we need them to pause for a moment while we do something, we use nonverbal communication to manage the flow of the conversation. If I need you to pause for a moment while I check my phone because it's really important, even if you were in the middle of a sentence and I needed to convey that it was really important, I could be like, right? And check my phone. And I didn't do it haphazardly. I didn't use any words, but I conveyed that I wasn't doing it lightheartedly. If I was trying to not communicate and trying to not manage the conversation with nonverbal communication, it would just be more casual and I wouldn't indicate any regret or importance or anything. I would just go, right? Which is another nonverbal communication. But what we're saying is that you can use these to manage. Or that if we're in a conversation with multiple people and we need one person to wait, and we want to talk about what the other person's saying, but we want to acknowledge both, this acknowledges the person over here. They may not want to pause, but at least acknowledges them while we're pointing at a person over here like, oh, yeah, this. Especially in large group discussions where one person leads the discussion. If we were all physically in the same room, a lot of nonverbal communication would be directing who was going to speak when. You may have noticed that in all of your classrooms. Nonverbal communication can also be a maintenance for relationships. Relationships are maintained through nonverbal communication. I am nonverbally communicating when I stop into the general studies office and check in on everyone. Hello, how are you doing? My words are checking in, but more so it's that I physically stopped in. My nonverbal communication is I'm interested in this professional relationship. How are you? High fives, holding hands, snuggles, patting your dog, right? That physical nonverbal communication. Or baby snuggles, right? Go back to that earliest communication. What Harry Harlow referred to as the science of love, that was nonverbal communication to babies. And of course, we also, talk to babies, but part of the physical care of maintaining that relationship, that earliest communication that makes them feel secure, is touch. So touch is a really important nonverbal communication. It also helps us inform impressions. When we are reading brand new people or brand new situations, We are automatically not just listening to the words of all of the new people, not all of the new words on the signs in the new situation. We are very clued in to what the body language of everyone is doing. When we walk into a new office, is everyone being very formal and polite? Is everybody high-fiving, fist bumping? We immediately notice if everyone is feeling nervous and tense, if everybody is feeling super chill. Anytime we walk into a new situation, even one that we've been into before, we can take the temperature of the situation by checking out everyone's nonverbal communications. Unfortunately, this can also go wrong, and we'll talk about this some more in a little while as well, is that if we walk into a room and we perceive that everyone is being really harsh and they're sitting like this, what if it's a group of people who, even when they're super chill, just have the world's best posture? It's happened. I have walked into a room full of dancers who just always, even when they're super relaxed, carry themselves in a really formal way. And so they were feeling happy and delighted to be where they were. And I thought, oh, formal room, put on formal personality. So we can read these things really wrong. If we step into a co-culture that does not have the same nonverbal communication that we have, we can get it really wrong. It can be used to spread influence. Someone who wants to spread influence and get a message across can use their nonverbal communication to seem very confident, very directive, taking charge, showing everyone what to do, pointing at information, conveying with their tone and their speed that they are spot on. Here's exactly how everything is. They can spread influence. Or through comedy or a pop star, whatever their nonverbals are, fashion, laughter, silly facial expressions, formal, in charge facial expressions, all of these things get certain messages across and help spread influence. So leaders tend to be very cued in to nonverbal, such as bosses in an interview. They tend to be very cued in about what our posture is saying. It can also be used to conceal information, right? So you could literally hide communication by standing in front of it. That would be concealing information. Or if someone's feeling really nervous, but they've practiced feeling chill, they will have control of their posture and their breathing, and they will actually be able to conceal that they feel nervous. It can also be a misdirection, right? So if I didn't clean my room before somebody comes over, I might just physically communicate which part of the house I'd like them to be in, so that it's not my room, to conceal the information that my room is the messiest part of the house. Or more literally in a magic trick. More literally in a magic trick, a magician can direct your attention non-verbally away from what is actually happening, the secret to the trick. They will non-verbally communicate that the thing you should be looking at is up here very effectively, so that you don't notice that the key to the trick is happening down here. So because one of the primary functions of nonverbal communication can be to conceal information, we often believe that we can sense when someone is lying, that there are nonverbal cues to truth-telling versus lying. So we are going to watch a short TED video about whether or not this is really the case. So as you go through this TED video, I want you to watch and decide if they are saying that language and language use or nonverbal communication is a more accurate guide that can be trusted relative to whether or not someone's lying. Okay, so pause here, go watch Detecting Deception, The Language of Lies on TED, and I will count to 3 and we'll continue. 1, 2, 3. So, as you saw, most versions of physical lie detectors, whether it's checking your pulse or your blood pressure or an electroencephalogram, which is really fancy, mostly they don't work. There are really easy ways to beat them if you've studied. Can an average person beat any of these? Probably not. But because we are often more in charge of our physiology than we'd like to admit, they can be beaten. They're so unreliable that they're not allowed in court. And actually, harken back to what we've discovered about language, language use is actually more reliable as a lie detector, meaning that it is sometimes a mistake when we rely too much on body language. Maybe that person is just nervous. Maybe they don't feel well. Maybe they have social anxiety. Anything to make someone's posture go off is not necessarily lying. We should often, especially because all of this is culturally weighted, keep in mind that we actually may not be amazing lie detectors based on posture. It may be more about the language, which is what that TED video went into, that the lying tends to be about the weasel words, tends to be negative and impersonal and overly technical. We may want to pay attention more to the language sometimes than we do. There are 10 primary channels that carry all these functions. All of these functions that we've explored of why we communicate nonverbally, to maintain relationships, to direct conversations, to present emotions. There are 10 channels that we use to present this information. And those 10 channels begin with facial displays. So a face can be super angry or it can be super silly, right? So all of these facial expressions, some of which we feel are really obvious, convey, again, mostly emotion, because emotion is something that we really trust parts of our body to convey because it's such a bodily circumstance. So all of this is culturally connotated, but one culture that particularly focuses on facial expressions is American Sign Language. American Sign Language does not always come with a verbal. It does have lots of language, full on, complete language, amazing. But often the meaning of the language presented, the sign presented, is changed or at least tweaked with facial expressions. So I want you to go watch 2 American Sign Language videos. One is about facial expressions, and the other is using the word very. This is the word very, 2 V's, very. So go take a look at those, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about facial expressions and how, for any of us, whether we're using signs or verbal language, how our facial expression can change the meaning of the word or sign that we're using. Okay, pause here. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so not only in ASL, just like in all other language, does facial expression convey really basic information. They use it to alter, as do we all, a little bit more self-consciously than ASL users, the meaning of the word they're saying. For example, angry, this is the sign for angry, okay? Right? So if someone asked me how I was and I was just a little bit angry, I'd be like, whatever. Like, I'm annoyed. No big deal. Right? Like, you know, I'm a little grouchy, but it's not a giant deal. And then if I was really mad, my face, not just the gesture, but my face would go, ah, right? Like, oh my God, I'm so mad. The facial expression in ASL really changes that. And while some of us feel comfortable doing that in spoken English, it's often not the case. Sometimes the verbal takes over, right? And we'll say, I'm really pissed off. We don't usually do the full face, right? And so sometimes by tuning into ASL, we can get a little bit better of an idea of how to use our facial expressions to convey the severity of what we're discussing, to better non-verbally communicate emotions that we rely on, you know, through nonverbal communication. Something else, one of the other 10 main channels is eye contact or eye behaviors, whether or not we're making eye contact, and where do our eyes go first on a face and what can go wrong. So again, there are 2 videos. Go watch the 2 videos, one about visually processing faces and one about how dogs interact with humans relative to eyes. So go take a look at those and come right back and we'll discuss. 1, 2, 3. So eye contact in human conversations is so important that the animal that we jokingly refer to as man's best friend has co-evolved with us to use the same pattern of facial recognition and checking that we do. It's not just that we can glance at a treat, even without moving our heads, which I just did. Obviously, I'm not very good for the control part of that experiment. But that if they want to know how we're feeling, they will check the same direction of spots that a human checks. We have co-evolved so fully that in order to communicate with us, they had to figure out how to read our faces. Eye contact is so important to communicating non-verbally to humans that those animals that have evolved most closely with us over the last several centuries, a little more than that, can do the same thing. So keep in mind that when eye contact goes wrong, if we're glancing down at our phone too much, or if we have social anxiety and we're glancing down, or if we're staring too intently, these things to humans matter a lot. So some of us as human beings have to practice what it is that's expected out of eye movements when we're communicating. And that just becomes a process to study for some of us. How much looking away is too much looking away? How much looking in the eyeball is too much looking in the eyeball? And those who happen to just be amazing nonverbal communicators and get it just right often just have to be patient with the rest of us who do not inherently come equipped with the same eye movements. You know, lots of things, like everything from macular degeneration that can change how our eye moves to autism, which can make eye contact too intense to bear, results in a lot of looking away or overcompensating and staring. So a lot of us have to practice it, and everybody who doesn't have to practice it often has to be patient while this important part of nonverbal human communication is practiced. Okay. In addition, obviously, to eye movement and facial expression are gestures and movement. This includes full body movements and also just hand movements, right? Like the full body, yes, I'm excited, versus like the hand and arm, hey, I'm excited. All of these things about how we move are nonverbal communication or non-linguistic communication. I mean, of course, again, except in the instance of American Sign Language, where those gestures are actually language. And this can be emblems, right? Like peace, right? That's not just a feeling. Like this could be a feeling. This is more of an actual word, right? Peace, an emblem. It has a direct language translation, as do, of course, all of American Sign Language. Illustrators, pointing, right? It illustrates where something is. I'm talking about this. I'm talking about that. It illustrates exactly which object is the pronoun. It can also be an affectation. An affect is something that you're putting on for airs, like the wink, or the finger quotes, or if you're pretending to be British and very lofty, you would immediately not just change your voice, but your hands would start doing Julia Child's things, right? An affectation, something that you've purposely put on to non-verbally seem more grandiose. And then there is also an adapter. An adapter would be reaching for a glass of water. It's adapting to your situation. If your throat is dry, you need to adapt to it and get a drink of water. If your nose itches, you need to adapt to it and do this. And it's nonverbal communication, but it's rarely about the other party. It's usually just about the person putting on a sweater if they're cold. Regulators is the same as directing conversation. Gestures are largely the nonverbal communication that regulates the conversation, right? Again, with the, oh, yep, just a minute, and you, what did you, oh, good, right? Regulating. And something that can happen with communication disorders is that we think it's all about language, right? We tend to think of maybe a lisp or a stutter, but these things tend to involve more than the language. These are not just language disorders. They can involve whole body communication. So there's a video that was maybe not very kindly shot in the first place that can illustrate for us that a full communication nonverbal disorder can affect not just the words, it's not just a stutter or a lisp or a cleft palate, that it affects full body ability to express what is going on, right? So there's a video of a young guy who has Tourette's, and I think that the video is probably not shot very nicely in the first place, but we're going to watch it thoughtfully and kindly and appreciate what struggles this young man has to go through in order to express himself. So go take a look at that. 1, 2, 3. So did you see how it's not just his language that's affected? It's not just a shouting out of language, right? And that's the stereotype that we imagine with lots of communication disorders, is that it's just about the mouth and the lungs and shouting of vocabulary. Or we picture that when our grandmother has dementia, it's just a word that she can't come up with. But often it's more than that. It's often the entire system of communication and expression is neurobiologically different, right? So not just these gestures, but not just the language, the whole nonverbal communication can be off. So sometimes, to indicate patience, we again go back to this touch concept, that touch can indicate listening. And of course, we have to be careful with it, right? It can super obviously go wrong, right? Like, it's why elementary school teachers, teach kids the difference between good touch and bad touch, is that there's a difference between someone you know well enough to put a hand on the shoulder versus obviously what's wildly inappropriate. If that's not obvious, I encourage you to Google it to find out the differences. We're not going to go into it here. But it can indicate listening. It can indicate caregiving. Again, not just for the babies, but I see you struggling to express. And if we can't do it verbally, then maybe we can do it physically. But they'll always be aware of others' cues. Did they tense when you did that? Did they appreciate it? Tune in. Google the differences between good touch and bad touch, but know that it can be an important channel for nonverbal communication. In addition to communicating affection and listening and caregiving, it can also be about power and control. If somebody leans in and grabs you, right, doesn't feel good. If they loom over you, it's about power and control. If someone, without touching you, guides you a certain way, it's all about the control and power. It can also be used actually aggressively with actual harmful communication, like hitting or pushing, right? So abuse and feelings and emotion that are negative can be communicated physically, just like the positive versions. We also have ritualistic touch, like a handshake, right? It's a ritual. It's a cultural signifier, or bowing, or touching foreheads, or a fist bump, or high-fiving in a line after a sporting event. These things are ritualistic. They're ritualized into culture. It's not a spontaneous, I would like to touch your hand because it would, feel joyful to me. We've actually encoded that if you're feeling joy with a buddy, you can high five. It's not a spontaneous thing. It's completely coded in culture. Also, silence. Silence is another form of vocal behavior, not just of touch, not just of keeping your body silent, but vocally, when it's not language, We can use a lack of language, like a silence, to carry lots of meaning. Thoughtful pause, ignoring, anger, sadness, right? But that lack of vocalization tends to be one vocal behavior that's not language, it's not verbal, but it's still communicating. So is inflection, and volume and rate. How fast we're speaking, how slow we're speaking. Are we excited? Are we nervous? Are we bored? Are we sleepy? Filler words like How often do I say as I'm making these videos? It's just a filler word, and it can communicate that someone is thinking, that someone has to glance down at their notes. It can mean someone doesn't know what they're going to say next, either in a big fall through lack of information way, or just in a processing the next example kind of way. Those filler words can communicate a lot. Pronunciation, accent, or tics. Tics can be something that's not language, but is verbal, right? So much like how we would stereotype Tourette's, is that those verbal tics that are coming through are part of that struggle to communicate non-verbally. Smell is often very tied into nonverbal communication. What would it communicate to you if you stepped into a classroom for the beginning of class and the last class was ending and they were barely getting out of there on time and the room was warm and it just smelled like lots of people? I mean, you would just know that they'd been in there with the door closed, working hard, maybe frantically. So these physical sensations like smell can communicate quite a bit to us. Like, oh, it's kind of stuffy in here. You guys working hard today? You know, we can kind of tell something about the smell. We also use it as a cultural signifier of hygiene, and it varies widely from culture to culture. If you work on a farm, you are more likely to have manure on your boots all day, every day, because that is your work. That is what you do. It doesn't mean you don't have good hygiene. It means that is life. That is what life smells like until you get in and put on your house shoes, right? Or other cultures don't shower as often. Certain families don't shower as often as others, right? The West Coast doesn't shower as often as the East Coast. So smell is part of a cultural signifier of hygiene and expected hygiene, which does not line up from place to place. So be careful about expectations of who showers when, including yourself, if you find yourself in an unfamiliar subculture. It can also be about memory. We can communicate things through memory. Smell and emotion and memory are really strongly connected. And again, this nonverbal emotional connection makes a lot of sense, and it's very much involved with our nose. You can tell what time of day it is by sniffing for bacon or coffee. You can tell what time of year it is by sniffing for pumpkin spice or grandma's cookies or turkey and cranberries. There are lots of things that memory-wise and emotionally-wise are part of nonverbal communication that includes our nose and smelling for things. And then use of space. Use of space can be how far away from people you like to be. Did you mind the shoulder touch that was trying to be thoughtful? Do you stand really close when you're talking? Do you actually fidget with somebody while you're talking? I had a grandfather who just could not talk to someone without like pinching their elbow. And at least it was an elbow that he picked, you know, fairly innocuous body part, but could not indicate his interest without this elbow pinching, which was sweet once you got used to it. But this use of space varies widely from culture to culture. So here is a little video about, this one happens to be European versus Mexican space bubbles and where that space bubble is set. So go watch some Europeans trying to experience Mexican space bubbles, and we'll talk about it when you get back. 1, 2, 3. So anytime we are stepping into a subculture or ethnicity that is different from ours, we should keep in mind that the space bubble is used differently. This is true even within West Coast versus East Coast, with the subculture of moms and kids or grandmothers versus somebody you've never met on the bus. Or it's even gendered, even between women who are best friends and men who are best friends. That space bubble is used really differently. So just be aware that when you step into a subculture, the nonverbal communication is all going to be different, especially including the space bubble. And then we also have physical sometimes we have tongue twisters. We have physical appearance. Physical appearance communicates a lot, and again, is super culturally specific, right? You might expect a communications professor to have nerdy glasses and crazy hair and, you know, plaid. Like that this office space is a little bit uncluttered. I feel like I'm not living up to my physical appearance code of English professor. I should have some more well flipped through books over here, or a poster about grammar. But this physical appearance conveys to us what kind of interaction we're about to have and how much weight is carried by the verbal that comes out of our mouths. So that we dress up for an interview, or we go to a new job and learn what it is we have to wear. What is the dress code? What style of hair is appreciated? And it's so specific. Virtually every subculture is going to have their own physical appearance code. And we just have to navigate it and be sensitive to all of our different co-cultures, because what works for us at home might not work if we have to go visit grandma's church, may not work at a wedding or an interview. Or if you wear your interview outfit to hang out with friends, it might be super awkward. Physical appearance codes tons, especially about subcultures. So keep that in mind. And then there's use of time. Who speaks for which amount of time? How on time should we be? If we say 4 o'clock, is it rude to come at 10 to 4? Is it rude to come at 4:30? Is it rude to come at 6? Use of time is, much like the several last that we just covered, very culturally specific. So you have to find out sometimes, even as narrow as a single person, what their time use preferences are and what their use of time communicates. Somebody who doesn't like to talk about themselves may love if we go on and on and on and don't expect them to talk. That use of time to somebody who wants to talk about themselves would be insulting. Showing up late or early for somebody who likes the opposite can be super insulting. So we often just have to figure out which nonverbal time use code we are actually using. And artifacts, objects communicate a lot, right? My lack of objects, my lack of props and artifacts is part of what's not communicating English professor office, right? Like, I should have some more pens, should maybe have one stuck behind my ear and it should be red from grading papers, or instead of cleaning up my books and putting them back on a bookshelf, they should be, you know, stacked here. Or the bookshelf should be right behind me. I actually thought that would just be a complicated background to look at in the video. But the props that someone has non-verbally communicates a lot. The actual objects that are present. If someone's carrying a shovel, you immediately go through in your mind the list of reasons of what they could be communicating about their activity with a shovel. Or a tutu. If you see a child wearing a tutu on the way into the YMCA, that object, that artifact, might mean dance class versus a leotard for gymnastics class, or a towel and swimsuit for swim class. So these objects tend to indicate tons. They communicate quite a bit of information. If you have a fork or a pen in your hand, right? They can communicate a lot, virtually to infinity. So because there are so many channels and so many characteristics and ways to use nonverbal communication, how on earth do we go about being sensitive about this? And the answer tends to be the same as we do For everything else, switching between situations and subcultures. If there is a co-culture that we don't understand, first of all, we have to be mindful of our own styles. What do I need in order to communicate? Do I need it to not be too warm? Do I need it to not be too smelly? Do I gesture so much? Should I not put my hand on the shoulder of the person on the bus? Should I be more patient when someone has a stutter or other communication disorder? Just to know that I tend to speak quickly. Sometimes I should slow down. I tend to be loud. Sometimes I should be quiet. Knowing our own nonverbal communication tendencies can help us fit in. And then in addition to being mindful to ourselves, anticipating a situation in which we might not understand the nonverbals, right? So if we step into a conference of neuroscientists, we may not know anything about their code. And if we're paying attention to nonverbal communication, we'll know that before we walk in. We may not be as startled by their formal posture or their messy mad scientist hair if before we step in we go, okay, headed into a new co-culture, let's go see what the nonverbal is going to be like here. So noticing ourselves, noticing when we might step into another situation. Remembering that once we get in there, we are in someone else's co-culture that we don't know yet. We might just have to be chill and try to figure it out. Or conversely, if they're more excitable, we may have to amp up our energy level a little bit to match that co-culture. And always remembering the differing abilities, right? Is that neurobiology and physiology can deeply affect someone's nonverbal communications, right? So we should not automatically assume that someone who is nervous is lying. We should not automatically assume that someone in a wheelchair is trying to be standoffish with their posture. Maybe they have metal rods fused in their back. Or conversely, for slouching, may not have the musculature to stand upright. We have to be very careful that with bodies that in all of us limit the ways in which we can express ourselves, that we're not misinterpreting. And special situations. If there's a code you can study ahead of time, we should. If there is, and there is, an elaborate code of nonverbal communication for if you meet the Queen, we should study that first, right? Like if there are formal guidelines for how to interact in the United States Senate, and there are, we should probably read Robert's rules before we go in there. If there are gestures and actions that are very prescribed, we should know that. Some of them we can study ahead of time. And then the other thing is just to practice, right? We will not be perfectly comfortable the first time we notice a code switch is happening. We just have to remain patient, remain open to what we're learning about nonverbal communication, just like language and verbal communication. And then we can edit, right? We can reflect on how a certain interaction went, and we can ask for feedback, right? If we are just trying a new code switch, if we're just learning a new language, hey, how'd that go? You know, and it's okay to, again, be mindful and thoughtful and sometimes apologetic. I'm so sorry. I thought that was the sign for, I'm having a hard time coming up with an example here because I actually know how to swear in sign language, but oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I thought that was the sign for drain the bathtub, not for pooping on the floor, right? It's okay to be apologetic and flexible and find graceful ways to make mistakes so that we're not too scared to try. Because being mindful and trying out new situations and new nonverbal codes is part of how we will actually end up getting along in the world. So there we have nonverbal communications. Reread any parts of the chapter that didn't make sense, and I will see you both in your journals and on the discussion board.